The future has arrived. As the world and humanity itself moves faster and faster into unimaginable possibilities, old institutions that built connection and shaped our sense of meaning are falling by the wayside. In their wake, profound questions about ethics, our purpose, and spirituality demand new answers. Join your host, Scott Mason, in Season 2 of the Purpose Highway podcast. We will explore how these social changes will revolutionize our society. We will learn how they impact our own search for connection and meaning. And we will hear stories of influencers whose lives have had radical change from the inside and found profound connection to others and themselves through a new definition of meaning. The future has arrived. Are you ready?
When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA crafts small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's NOLA's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's NOLA is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's ITSNOLA.com. Guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's NOLA's website for yourself and find out how good it is. Hello, everybody. It's Scott Mason, revving up for another race down the Purpose Highway. And sitting next to me today in the front seat is Jon Dillow. Jon has been a mental health counselor for over 15 years. Although he has an MA in counseling, he also has a BA in chemical engineering. Jon is passionate about helping people find purpose, crafting a better relationship with suffering, and ending relational alienation. Jon, welcome to the show.
So glad to be here, Scott. Thanks for inviting me on.
I'm ecstatic too. This has been a long time coming, and it is going to be quite a conversation. And I'm going to begin this conversation right up front to the listener or the person watching. Jon and I had a fairly extensive pre-interview. And Jon, you also provided me with some pre-interview reading material. Mm-hmm. This conversation is going to be one of the most intellectually rigorous ones that has occurred in the history of this show. I think it's also going to be one of the most powerful ones. If you're listening or watching, be prepared. There may be some concepts that we discussed that are a little bit challenging or that may be new to you. We're going to make it clear, but I think that by the end of this episode, you're going to leave thinking about things a lot differently. That's why I'm so excited to have you on this show, Jon.
Well, goodness, Scott, with that setup, I hope I can live up to the hype. We'll see.
You can. You already, trust me, you can. Now, let's start with a little bit of a background on the themes of this show for those who are listening or watching for the first time. There are 2 concepts that are the philosophical underpinnings and the justifications for this season of the Purpose Highway to exist. The first is the silent revolution. And that is the truly seismic shift in thinking around purpose, spirituality, and ethics as they have been guided historically by major institutions that have connected people as they have searched for meaning through those three things. The silent revolution's impact has been the decline in historical religions throughout the Western world, as well as other parts of the planet. In some cases, with precipitous speed. And we do not see any deceleration of that trend.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned that these historically dominating institutions in the spirituality, ethics, and purpose space have been the places where people have connected in the search for meaning. And that connection is related to the second theme of this season, which is the secret plague. It is the alienation that data has shown, and anecdotally, people talk about all the time, from each other, that is infecting our culture and our society. We're seeing it played out through cultural and social and political divisions, or just loneliness. And during the past couple of years, this is being filmed during the COVID pandemic, through suicides, through depression. But this increase in alienation had been going on for some time. The Great Resignation, which for those who might be watching or viewing this years from now, is a dramatic departure from employment of people in labor because they're alienated. They're sick of their work situations. They're just up and leaving. And it's impacting business everywhere. So we are generally talking about the secret plague, the silent revolution, and how people can find connection to themselves, to spirituality, to ethical guidance systems, and to a sense of purpose when these institutions that might have helped them along before are going away.
Yeah.
Before we go into the unique perspective that you have on this problem, as well as some of the solutions that you have to offer, let's get to know you a little bit.
Yeah.
So one fun thing that we talk about, just as a warm-up episode after episode, is here is a mythological avatar. Greek mythology, I'm obsessed with it. I'm obsessed with it because it speaks to who and what we are inside if we can figure out why we identify with some character. And a few minutes ago, we talked about your avatar, at least for today. Who is it?
I'm probably going to pronounce his name wrong, but Sisyphus.
You got it right.
The poor fool who had to push the boulder up the hill for all of eternity. And so it's a rather, I guess, dark figure to identify with at this point, but that's the one that comes to mind for me.
And we will talk a little bit more in a second about why that might be something that you relate to, both from a cultural perspective or from your own perspective. And we'll be candid about that. And this will come up again during our conversation as the episode goes on. But for those who are not familiar with the story of Sisyphus, he was a king that offended the gods. He offended the gods by cheating death. And the gods were not going to tolerate that. So when he eventually was killed permanently, or when he died, I don't remember exactly how he died, his punishment was to do exactly what you just mentioned, John. There was a boulder that he had to roll up the hill forever. And just when he was about to get it to the top, it would always roll back down again. Yeah. And he was charged with rolling this hill over the top of or rolling the stone over the top of the hill. And so forever, billions of years, what he was destined to try and do and never succeed. And I tell that version of the story without explicitly stating something that's embedded in it, but maybe I will throw that out right now. Actually, there's two things that are embedded in it that I'll throw out right now. One, even in his eternal torment, Sisyphus felt hope, because otherwise he would never have kept trying to roll that doggone stone up the hill. Number two, uncertainty. He never really knew if this time would be the one that the rock finally was able to go over the top of the hill, roll down, and finish his task forever. Talk to us a little bit about what Sisyphus means to you.
Well, let me give a brief picture into my life before I do that. I'm a counselor, and I had my own counselor that I go to. The last 6 years have been pretty challenging, and I was sitting with that counselor, and I told him, I look into the future, and it feels utterly hopeless. And he turned to me and he said, Jon, knowing your story, knowing everything that's going on with you, that is exactly how you should feel. And I'm a counselor, so I know you don't normally tell your clients, yeah, that hopelessness you feel is exactly what you should feel. You try to buoy them up or give them perspective. But Sisyphus resonates with me because there is a way where, in my current circumstances, I look into the future and struggle to find hope. It does feel like I will be rolling that boulder up the hill for eternity, only to have it fall back down. And so some of my challenge as I reflect on that story is, where do I find the fuel and the reason to keep pushing that boulder up every day, somewhat expecting it to roll back down by the end of the day? So that's some of where Sisyphus has stood out to me in this season of my life.
It's fascinating that we associate hope in the way that is sort of underneath what you were describing, that conversation that you had with the counselor, which is as a positive thing. I assume the counselor said to you, I know I shouldn't be telling you that the situation seems hopeless, because that's telling you something that's fundamentally negative. And we're going to talk, by the way, a lot about what's really negative and not as this hour goes on. But I want to go down a brief rabbit hole. Because the topic of hope, particularly when it comes to purpose and spirituality, is a lot more loaded than it seems. Going into the theme of Greek mythology, the story of Pandora, she was given a jar by the gods and told never to open it. But she was curious, and she did anyway, right? And all of the evils that are in the world that torture humanity to this day, including death and disease, came out. So she slammed the jar shut once she realized what she'd done. And the only thing that didn't escape was hope. Now, what that story means is something I ponder a lot, because we assume that hope is a positive. Think about it. In that story, hope was something that was in a jar full of evil. She shut it to keep it in. So was she keeping hope away from the world? Or were they saying that hope is not what we commonly assume it to be? And perhaps that's part of Sisyphus's torture, the feeling of hope. In light of what happened with you and that counselor, as well as things like the silent revolution and particularly the secret plague, do you have any thoughts about hope as a concept?
Oh, absolutely. It is hard for us as creatures to function without some sense of hope, some sense that tomorrow could be better. And yet at the same time, hope it's really a dangerous commodity, because it raises our expectations and sets us up for a disappointment. So hope is double-edged in certain ways, where it's hard to move forward without some, and yet it also sets us up for great disappointments as well. So you'll see people who will tamp down on any hope. They'll purposely keep their hopes as low as possible to shield themselves from that disappointment. The downside for them is they tend to attempt very little things of great quality as a way to avoid those disappointments. So to me, hope is this double-edged sword. Hope often, I think, in our culture does have this very positive slant to it. I think some of what I'm grappling with and developing is a hope that is more gritty, that is more robust, that doesn't just look to the future and say good will occur, but a hope that looks into the future and says perfect will be accomplished. And so the hope is more rooted in meaning and purpose, which is the secret plague. I always get those two terms. You'll have to correct me, Scott. I'm gonna mix them up at some point.
That's fine. We're keeping it real here.
Yeah, for me, the hope right now is what is the purpose and meaning I attach myself to in life that draws me out of bed and draws me forward into a future, even if that future is one checkered by sorrows. And so hope isn't necessarily a rosy thing anymore. What my counselor did was actually so helpful, though, because he, in a way, he validated that rosy picture of hope was, at least in this season, not something I got to enjoy. And so it was probably the most affirming thing a counselor has said to me in a number of years.
And that's an absolutely fair point. Because of this positive cast and this assumption that we have that we should always be hopeful, some things can come out that I feel are toxic. So when I was in my 20s, I've not shared this on this podcast before. So you brought something out of me. But I went in for an operation to remove some adenoids in my nose as well to correct a deviated septum. The operation was a disaster. I ended up having to have a trach to stay alive.
Wow.
My left lung collapsed. I was in the hospital for a long time. The partner that I had at the time was a medical student. And he was told by the doctor and understood what was meant when there was said that Scott's condition is touch and go. For days. That went on. And so they called my mom in. My mom, I'm not criticizing her for this, but my mother kept saying, the worst is over. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And I remember my partner feeling very annoyed about that because he was saying, we have no evidence that that's true. You're telling this man something that he may end up with brain damage. He may end up dead, right? Like there's a whole lot of things going on here. And I actually didn't appreciate that either, coming from my mother, intentions aside, because by sort of throwing out this platitude of hope, I felt she was trivializing both what I was going through and what the future possibilities were.
Yeah. And I would agree with you, Scott. Some of what I hear in that story is a false hope offered to you by your mom in some ways because she was uncomfortable with the reality you both were facing together. She saw her son in that bed, and there was probably some part of her that realized this is touch and go. He may not ever get out of this bed. This could be brain damage. This could be permanent. People aren't comfortable with those realities. So then they offer us what you seem to be saying is a hope that feels toxic or almost even offensive in some ways when we get given that type of hope.
Hope only exists because of another theme that we're going to explore, and we've mentioned a little bit earlier in depth, and that is uncertainty.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about your feelings on the relationship between uncertainty and the development of human culture, our psyches, and even religion.
Okay. Well, I will give a brief foundation to this, and I'm sure there'll be some very smart people who can actually comment and fill in some of the gaps that I'll miss. But when I deal with uncertainty, a lot of what I do in my counseling practice is help people who struggle with anxiety. I've got a 20-year struggling with anxiety myself. And so it's something I'm very familiar with. at the root of most anxiety is uncertainty. But let me take a step far outside of the counseling room and just talk about us as a species. We've got this huge brain in our head that allows us to do something that has been a massive evolutionary advantage. It allows us to time travel. We can step into dozens of alternate futures, different realities, and consider what might this future be like. And then we can plan and prepare. And that's allowed us to, I think, become the dominant species on this planet. There's a downside to that ability that our big brains have. And that is when we travel into all of these different futures, we don't live in the present like most animals do. We're living in this other reality. And it brings up that question of what if? What if the bad future comes about? What if this doesn't go well? And that leads us to that place of uncertainty. Now, that would be fine if most of us encountered uncertainty with a sense of optimism, a belief that when I face uncertainty, good things are going to happen. I think you might be that way, Scott. I sense that you're more optimistic as you look into the future. But most of us, and people will argue about this from different angles, but if we think evolutionarily, we've been given a negativity bias. We have this bias towards the negative so that as we encounter uncertainty, we don't see it as a wonderful surprise is waiting to occur. We instead look at it and say something bad's going to occur because that kept us alive. It was a survival adaptation to think towards the negative. So we're all skewed that way a little bit. So I think that one of the fundamental questions we as humans need to resolve is this question around uncertainty and how do we relate to uncertainty? Now, interrupt me at any point, Scott, but that happens in big and small ways. There's the uncertainty of, I'm going to ask this girl out, and is she going to say yes, or is my heart going to be broken?
Right.
So that's a low level uncertainty. But then we go way up the scale to those existential questions. What happens when I die? What will I do with suffering? Will I find meaningful connection and purpose in life? So we get into that uncertainty around the deepest of deep questions. And we need to resolve that in some way. So much of our struggles as humans can be traced back to an attempt to resolve uncertainty. Now, of course, you can think of lots of negative ways we try to resolve uncertainty. We try to minimize it. We try to avoid it. We medicate it. And these are ways that don't free us to live in a fully and robust human way. Instead, our world kind of shrinks in as we deal with uncertainty in that way. So that's kind of the start of how I think about uncertainty. But let me go a quick history of how at least the American society has dealt with it, at least in the last century. There was a period of time called the modernist era. Some people might trace it back to the Enlightenment up until maybe 1950, 1970, somewhere in that range. But this was a time period where truth was thought of as very black and white, very objective, very knowable. We answered the question of certainty or of uncertainty by saying, no, we can know what is true. We can know a certain answer. And so uncertainty is easy to deal with. We know what's true. You see this in the sciences during this phase, Newtonian physics. And we won't get into too much physics, but Newtonian physics was a branch of physics where if I threw a baseball, we could trace the arc of that baseball, and Newtonian physics would give me certainty of how high the arc of the ball would be, where it would land, how fast it would go. I could know with certainty what would happen. So we have science giving us a lot of certainty during this period. But then that certainty, I think, also bled into our religious expressions and institutions. Prior to probably the Enlightenment, religion was more mysterious. There was much more awe and wonder, and there was much more comfort with uncertainty. In this modernist period, where truth is knowable and science gives us the certain answers, religion started to adopt a similar stance towards these huge truths about existential realities. One example from my worldview, I'm a Christian, and during the 60s and 70s, there was a book that came out called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And the Christian world within this modernist period was very fixated on, we can find the truth, we can prove the truth, and we are right and you are wrong. And so that's kind of how religion and science worked together in the modernist era. And it gave us some advantages. We had an answer to the uncertainty question. We could form communities that were well situated around a common answer, which gave people a place of connection. It ended alienation, and it gave them a foundation from which to develop and build their sense of purpose and meaning. So that's a modernist era. It had some good things, had some bad things. Somewhere along the way, we shift into this postmodern era, which is a bit more characterized by truth being less black and white and more gray. Things are more subjective. From a worldview perspective, you would often hear there are many paths up the mountain, but we all get to the top. And so instead of answering certainty or answering uncertainty with a fixed black and white answer, suddenly we're acknowledging that, no, things are really fuzzy and gray. And we see that both in science and religion again. We see it in science, where we move from Newtonian physics to quantum physics, which is a strange, weird branch of physics where, for example, light is both a particle and a wave at the same time. So it's both black and white at the same time. And science is starting to enter into realms of study that are so bizarre that this idea of rigid black and white truth starts to be called into question. And I think that in part started to infiltrate some of the religious institutions at the younger generation. The old school folks were holding on to modernism and we have the right answer. The younger generations in many of our religious institutions, which is what I think we're seeing the result of now, they started to look at religion and say, you guys claim a certainty that doesn't fit my experience of reality. And not only that, it doesn't even fit the scientific understanding of our world. Things are far more complicated than you're leading us to believe. And so I think that's added to a breakdown in the religious institutions, and people in a generation younger than you and I, at least in kind of the Christian world, are leaving the church in droves.
Yes.
So the advantage of the postmodern position is it makes space for complexity. And the reality is, you laying on the table with the trach in you after that surgery, there wasn't a simple hope to give you. There was, Scott, I see you there, and this might be the rest of your life. And we want to encourage you to press forward despite that frightening possibility. So it's a much messier place than the simplistic hope that your mom, and I'll assume with great intentions, the simplistic hope that she gave you.
Right.
So.
Okay. There was a lot in there. And my mind is twirling in a zillion different directions. So I'll try and focus myself in order to come out with some questions and some thoughts that can generate further meaningful discussion in a way that is somewhat cogent. I'll start perhaps by going back to your discussion of the emergence of modernism. One of the things that triggered in me, again, going back to my mythological obsession and general theme that is in all of our discussions on this show with relation to that, is thinking about the earlier Greek religions. I hadn't thought about this until you said this, but the comfort that you indicated that they had with uncertainty and shading answers and possibilities and the realities of the world are reflected in two things that immediately come to mind. First of all, pantheism itself reflects the concept that the world might be too complex or too varied for a single God to manifest itself as all-encompassing. And so you have all of these different deities out there. And not only that, but oftentimes they were deities that were coming into contact with each other if they were from different cultures. And people were like, okay, well, whatever, that's another God.
Yeah.
So there's that expression of it. But then there's another component of these religions, particularly in Greece and Rome, that is interesting, that goes as to uncertainty. And that is relating to the word uncertainty itself. What is the expression of uncertainty in our language? A mystery. And the word mystery comes from the very religious practices of a lot of these pagan religions themselves. The mystery religions involved initiations into either cults of particular gods or goddesses, or even heroes that were believed to be still alive after death. And once you were initiated into these cults, right, you couldn't tell what happened during the initiation, right? You knew certain things that no one else knew. And there was an acceptance of mystery as part of the religious experience. Now, of course, a lot of the myths evolved to explain things that people needed an explanation for, but there wasn't, even those things had embedded within them an acceptance of the mystery of divinity. And what I'm hearing is that this modernistic shift part of what may have led to the decline of some of these religions, and of course I don't pretend to be an expert in the exact reason why it's declined, but may have been the consolidation of thinking into a single, around the role of religion and its accompanying spiritual response, right, into a single deity. But it also makes me think that the modernistic approach to thinking, which came, of course, much later as these religious institutions were solidified as cultural forces, may have actually set up themselves for downfall later. Because anytime that you're claiming to have access to certain truths, the reality is that the world is too complicated. What's your reaction hearing that little soliloquy?
The idea that pantheism allows for some broader understanding or way to engage with the complexity of the world, and that's what in the ancient world maybe preceded the more modern era, makes so much sense to me. And I think in the modern era, as science became more narrow and mystery was done away with, we understood why things happened that before seemed so mysterious. There's something a bit reductionistic about that. It's almost like you see a magician on stage and he performs a trick, and it's mysterious and magical until you pull the curtain back and you see the device and you see the way he's done the trick. And so science did away with much of our mystery. And then I think religion started to adopt that and became smaller and sadly more rigid. You mentioned that the institutions of religion may have set themselves up for a fall. I think one of the challenges in our religious rigidity is we're not able to grow and adapt. That orthodoxy in whatever religion you ascribe to, there's almost a incentive to hold tightly to that, even if new information is brought forth. And not even just in the orthodox tenets of that religion, but how those tenets are brought into the current culture. Again, I'll speak from my experience I think our Christianity as it existed when I grew up will be dead 10 years from now. It won't exist anymore. Because we have a rigidity around the way we've practiced our faith that has not allowed it to adapt to a changing culture. So it's not that the religious tenets of different faiths need to change, but there's a rigidity in the practice that doesn't allow them to adapt and become different expressions given the culture.
Fascinating. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more, I suspect, as the hour goes on. But I wanted to also throw out another thought that your discussion earlier brought to mind, and that is around the negativity bias we have in association with uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I'll think about this from a historical point of view that's far deeper than Greek mythology even.
Mm.
That is the earliest origins of the human race.
Mm.
On the one hand, you're right. It's impossible to argue with the fact that avoidance of uncertainty had a positive component to it from an evolutionary perspective because, right, if we're just eating every plant that's out there, or if we're walking into a strange forest where there could be any sort of predator, and we're just like, oh, let's just see what happens today, and it's fun. And the next thing you know, you're being eaten. That's problematic for the survival of the species. However, humans spread around the globe. Yeah. Probably more so than any non-flying animal that's not, I was going to say non-flying animal, or non-marine animal. And we did that because on some level, we had to have a population group within our evolving society that had that level of comfort or even embracing of uncertainty. I think about the colonization, and I don't mean the European colonization, but the very earliest colonization of places like Australia or some remote Pacific islands. Probably even the Americas themselves. When you think about it, they had to cross this ice strait across, from what's now Siberia into North America. They didn't know what was on the other side of that land bridge. Yeah. And they did it. And so, I once had a coach tell me when I was talking about some fear I had about something that was uncertain. She goes, why are you only imagining limitation? Why aren't you imagining everything being possible? Yeah. That was a challenge for me. She shut me up. I needed to hear that. But how do you think that the human mind or human culture manages that interplay? Or do you think that maybe that tension is what has enabled us to be so successful as a species, whereas other animals might not have it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think humanity is always in tension with itself. There is a drive to expand and to move out and to cross that ice bridge, as you mentioned. We'd have to imagine what motivated those people to do that. I think in our earliest form of humanity, it was more driven by basic need. The place I'm at, there at some point would be reached, a tipping point would be reached where the place I'm at is not meeting my basic needs, so I will risk going somewhere else. But as long as there was plenty and abundance where you were, you generally stayed put, most people. You had those rare explorers who might have faced uncertainty with a bit more zeal and exuberance, and they would run out and they would adventure and find things and come back. And then the more frightened or more timid majority would hear about the great place that they discovered, and then they might go there themselves. So I think there's some tensions. I don't think humanity has worked to avoid uncertainty. I'm sorry if I misspoke. It's more when confronted with uncertainty, we do exactly what happened between you and your coach. We tend to think about what's going to go wrong. We have to almost consciously and deliberately try to think about all the great things that could happen. So our default setting is a bit more of uncertainty could be bad, but we have the ability to consciously shift that to what your coach instructed you to do.
You and I both, in different ways and from different perspectives, have fingers in the various pies of the self-improvement space. Yeah. Presumably no one is going to see a counselor if they have no desire to improve at all, unless they're forced to go. And even then, presumably, like if they're in jail, maybe they don't want to be in there anymore. Or they want to, right, whatever. And I work with people who are looking to make changes in their lives because they feel stuck within toxic myths. Yeah. Interestingly enough, uncertainty itself is not discussed very often as an underpinning in the self-improvement space, at least explicitly. And it's interesting because, for instance, I was thinking about techniques that people have for self-betterment of more or less degrees of what I personally think may be grounding, like manifesting.
Yeah.
A lot of folks, right, believe you manifest, it'll happen. Or seeing psychics or other affirmations or other tools and techniques that have popularity. And I'm not making any statement about their validity or not at all. But when you talk about those things, you're talking about them as ways to improve, but not necessarily ways to deal with uncertainty. Why do you think that is?
Well, there's a lot of answers to that question. Let me back up. You said there's a tendency not to talk about uncertainty. And maybe in the self-help and even in the counseling realm, a tendency to see people wanting to stay where they're at. I think there is a great appeal to the status quo, even if it's a very uncomfortable status quo. Because I know what this feels like. I know how good or bad it is. I don't know what it will be tomorrow or if I go somewhere else. So there's an appeal psychologically to the status quo, but there's also an appeal neurologically to the status quo. Our brains like to keep things pretty static. We develop routines, we develop pathways in our brain, and it takes effort metabolically to change those pathways. So there's almost a sense of friction that we have to encounter to move from where we're at to somewhere new. And so people will stay put, or they try to find ways to avoid that friction. Manifesting, which I'm very familiar with and understand some of the concepts around, at times can feel like a way to short circuit that friction. I'm going to tell myself, I am successful and powerful and strong and confident. I'm going to tell myself that every day. That does have some effect on people. But at the same time, our brains aren't stupid. Our brains, they catch the lie. If I'm not feeling confident and powerful and successful, my brain's not going to buy that statement. For me to say, I will make $1 million this year is kind of very simplistic manifestation. My brain also can say, well, maybe you will, but you don't have a plan. But it does have some value because it gets my brain thinking about how could I make $1 million? So it's not that manifesting doesn't work, but at times it can feel like a way to skirt reality or short circuit uncertainty that I don't think always helps. What I suggest instead is a type of affirmation or manifestation that's more honest. I am growing in confidence, or I am pursuing making $1 million. So then our brain can say, oh, okay, I buy that. That seems reasonable. You are actually pursuing that. Then our brain can get on board with that change, as opposed to we find this resistance in our brain when I say I am a millionaire. My brain says, no, you're not.
Right. Look at that bank account.
Yeah. I saw what you ate for dinner, John. You're not a millionaire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ramen noodles for the 10th night in a row.
Absolutely.
Bro, that ain't millionaire food.
No. Yeah. Well, and the other, just one quick other thing is, I think, and this is very American focused here, is generally speaking, we have lived with such affluence that has shielded us from most suffering that the world has to encounter on a daily basis. And so many of us have grown up in such a buffered place. And I'm not denying whatever suffering you or anyone else has had. There is real suffering in America, but as a culture, I think the message is a little bit along the lines of, we can overcome suffering. We can make disease, illness, sadness, whatever it is, we can make it go away. So the goal is to make suffering stop. And I don't think that's congruent with reality. Suffering is a given reality. And if we don't accept that, embrace that, then we're living in a somewhat delusional way.
I wonder if that is some of the lesson of the Sisyphus myth too.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk also about, maybe I'll just share a story that illustrates this point. So I worked for government for 20 years. Can't believe it now that I look back on it, especially.
Yeah.
I'm not even 30 yet. I mean, what was I doing starting working in a government job at age 10? But in any event, one of my mentors, a genius, someone who I have always looked up to, and I do not use the word genius lightly, told me when I left government work, I left it without another job. I vested in my pension. I couldn't stand it anymore. And I was ready to just do anything to get out of it. So I left without a plan. I left without a job. Of course, it was the tail end of the Great Recession. Brilliant, genius. Yeah. But in any event, my friend took me out and he said, you know, Scott, you remind me of the people who were in Europe during the 1700s or 1600s. And there were some that got on that boat and they were aware that the boat might sink to the bottom of the ocean, but they were willing to take that risk and leave. I'm suffering. I'm miserable. I hate working for the city. I hate my job, but I'm the person that would have stayed in the squalor of Europe no matter what. Then when he retired years later, he told me after he retired, I realized that nothing that I did in my career had any impact whatsoever. Nothing. I've learned to be comfortable with that, but I had no impact. Nothing I did. Anyone could have done anything that I did.
Yeah.
And so to me, that is bridging an example of how what you're talking about, avoidance of suffering or perceived avoidance of suffering, comfort and thinking about certainty or uncertainty come together with what I might say from a purpose-driven perspective is a catastrophic outcome. Even if he was comfortable with it, ethically, I don't know that I'm comfortable with it because this man had gifts that the universe needs. What are your thoughts hearing that?
That is one of the things that drives me as I sit with clients who I see are making compromises with themselves to accept a reality similar to that man you just described. Realities that are small, that are uncomfortable, that are broken. And they will settle for those. They will settle for that temporary solace of not having to get on the boat and risk going overseas, not realizing that 20 years from now, similar to your friend, they retire and say, I have nothing of value in my career. And I couldn't agree with you more that the waste of the gift that person had to give is catastrophic for our world. And so much of what I want to do is help see people understand the great thing that they have to contribute and then find the courage to do that. But most of us are too afraid.
Well, Jon, it has been great taking a ride with you today. Thank you for joining us. Now, for everyone listening, this is only the first of 2 episodes with Jon, where we're going to talk about managing uncertainty in a lot of detail. Next time, we're going to go a little bit further into how dealing with and addressing suffering in our lives can help us manage change and deal with uncertainty in a far more productive way. We're also going to talk about the tendency to focus on brokenness, as well as our weaknesses as a hindrance when it comes to dealing with uncertainty. Finally, we're going to talk about the role of scarcity and abundance when it comes to facing uncertainty. It's going to be every bit as intellectually challenging, thought-provoking, and fun as this episode has been. I look forward to seeing you next time. If you like this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple or a comment on YouTube. And I shall see you and Jon Dillow next time for another trip down the Purpose Highway. When you're racing down the Purpose Highway, we want to make sure you're healthy and happy every step of the way. That's why we're proud to partner with It's NOLA, 21st century plant-based healthy granola snack bites made with real ingredients and audacious flavor. It's NOLA craft small batch hand-rolled granola balls that are vegan, gluten-free, and naturally low in sugar. It's Nola's delightful bites come in 3 flavors: luscious cranberry coconut, sassy mango masala, and dark, decadent, chewy chocolate. It's Nola is available to both individual customers and for wholesale accounts at itsnola.com. That's itsnola.com. Guests on this show are already enjoying this delicious snack. Check out It's Nola's website for yourself and find out how good it is.